Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great privilege to welcome you to tonight's Public Affairs program. As you know, the Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia, and we use the spirit, the values of this great institution, the Union League of Philadelphia, for all kinds of programs, lectures, civics education, care of our collections, all for the purpose of creating more informed, better engaged citizen leaders. And we do these programs for a variety of audiences, most importantly, students and high school students. And I want to thank some of our students that are here with us tonight, thanks to their teacher, Kathy Quinter, at St. Joe's Prep. And thank you for being here, gentlemen. So just a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you would take just a moment to silence your cell phones, please. Tonight's program will include a Q&A with our speaker, and we're going to do that through the cards. So you should all have cards at your seats. The staff will come around and collect them, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. I'd ask at the conclusion of our program, please allow Ambassador Bolton to leave the room before everyone gets up and leaves. We appreciate that. And we have quite a lineup of programs this fall. And next Monday, we have a fantastic program on the Supreme Court with John Yoo, Jeff Rosen, and Robbie George. That program will be probably sold out. So please make your reservations, go to the Union League website, call the Legacy Foundation, give us an email. We hope to see you next Monday evening. The work of the foundation is made possible through the leadership and the generosity of members, by and large, and others who share our values. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you one such great leader, the 70th president of the Union League and chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Mr. Jim Dunnigan, who will introduce our speaker. Jim.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge the president of the Union League. He is a great leader who is dedicated to both the League and to the work of the Legacy Foundation. Please join me in acknowledging the 73rd president of the Union League, Mr. Harry Hill. And as John said, the work of the foundation is made possible through the dedication of many volunteer leaders and friends. And I want to thank two such leaders this evening. They were childhood friends who grew up in the Philly suburbs, and without them and their good work and their connections, tonight would not have happened. Please join me in thanking the chair of the Education Committee, Mr. Steve Target, and one of our great partners of the Legacy Foundation, Mr. John Yoo. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Ambassador John Bolton. Born in Baltimore, John was the son of a fireman and attended Yale University and then Yale Law School, where he studied with Robert Bork. After a time in private practice, he began his public service in the Reagan administration. Over the past 4 decades, he has served in a wide range of important roles in 4 administrations. He was the United States Assistant Attorney General for President Ronald Reagan from 1985 to 1989. He served in the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs from 1989 to 1993. He was the 26th National Security Advisor from 2018 to 2019, and the 25th Ambassador to the United Nations from 2005 to 2006. Bolton is, without question, among the most important foreign policy and defense specialists of the last 35 years, and he continues to be an influential political, defense, and international policy expert. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable John Bolton.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening, and appreciate all of you turning out on a misty Philadelphia night. The weather's the same in Washington, so it's probably my fault that you're enjoying it, but I'm glad you're all here. I wanted to talk about the shape of the most significant threats that the United States is going to face over the next several decades, and I think it's important because we are, whether we like it or not, we're in a presidential campaign season again already, and I think one of the difficulties we face kind of across the board in the United States is that our presidential candidates don't debate foreign and defense policy issues enough, and I think that's really our fault as voters. You know, if anybody ever did a time and motion study of how a president spends his day, what preoccupies him, what takes up his time, the amount that's devoted to national security issues is really pretty extraordinary. You don't see that necessarily on the schedules because we don't talk about a lot of what happens. People see visits of heads of state and so on, but they don't really have much of an idea of what goes on that doesn't appear on the schedule, and it eats up an awful lot of time, and a lot of it's preparation, decision-making, discussion, follow through, talking to foreign leaders, talking to various parts of the federal establishment. But when you compare all of that time that a president spends on foreign policy and defense policy to the amount of time that presidential candidates debate it, the disjunction is enormous. So voters are voting for president, in my view, the most important element of which is the defense of our country from external threats, knowing next to nothing about what the candidates believe in or whether they're competent to hold the job. They talk about a lot of other things, but we're making a decision on the presidency very poorly informed overall. So I just think it's important for citizens and voters. Number one, each of us has that responsibility in judging candidates to assess where they stand on the issues, but also pushing the politicians to talk about what's most important. And people say, well, you know, it's the economy, stupid. That's true. Well, where do you think the economy gets protection for all of the benefits that we enjoy here in America? It's not because there's some natural order in the world. The only order in the world that's really existed since 1945, to the extent there has been one, is the power of the United States and its alliances around the world. And if that power diminishes, or we're afraid to protect our interests, we will suffer here at home. So this is, I think, important. And as I say, in the middle of the beginning, at least, of a presidential campaign, really to get the candidates to talk about it. And I think it's even more important because this year, I believe we've entered into a new historical period. You know, we had after World War II, we had the Cold War, obviously. Then we had the post-Cold War era, which is not a particularly original name, but it was accurate, at least historically. And now we're moving into a new era. We don't have a name for it yet. Somebody will come up with one. It's hard to define the places when these shifts take place. In the case of the Cold War, it's actually pretty easy. The Cold War ended on December the 26th, 1991. That was the night, and many of you will remember the picture of the Soviet flag coming down over the Kremlin in Moscow and the Russian flag going up, representing the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Warsaw Pact had collapsed before that, but that single event demonstrated that the Cold War was over, and frankly, that we had won. The post-Cold War era was much more confused, interspersed with terrorist attacks like 9/11. But with changes that were going on that were not very visible. Now, I think those changes have become manifest, and we can see what this next period in history is going to look like. And I think that the post-Cold War era ended and this new period began with the visits of Chinese leader Xi Jinping to Moscow, where he and Vladimir Putin declared that they had formed a partnership without limits and agreed to a whole range of areas of cooperation. This is a new axis, and axis is the right word to describe it. It resembles in some respects the Sino-Soviet alliance of the Cold War, but with one obvious and critical difference. China is the senior partner and Russia is the junior partner. There are already outriders that are allied with this axis: North Korea, Iran, Syria, Belarus, maybe some others will come into play. And so you can see it on a map very easily. What it means, I think, is that a lot of what we have considered to be regional conflicts, and I'll talk about some of them, are now global conflicts. And I think we need to reorganize our thinking about international affairs. We need to reorganize our intelligence collection. We need to reorganize our defense capabilities to take this new axis into account. And since the dominant player is China, I think it's important to start there with what we've gotten wrong about China over much of the past half century. We've gotten a lot wrong about Russia too, but China is the dominant threat that the United States faces. It is in fact an existential threat to the West for the rest of this century, and how we deal with it is obviously going to have a huge impact on the kind of life we have here in the United States. Now, a lot of people believed that China had fundamentally changed beginning in the mid-1980s when the then paramount Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping began to try and recover from the chaos, first of the Great Leap Forward and then the Cultural Revolution, which between these two catastrophic Mao Zedong policies killed tens of millions of Chinese, destroyed much of the legacy of Chinese culture, tried to revolutionize the Chinese people, and all utterly failed. It was one of the worst ongoing human tragedies in a century of tragedies that the world had seen. And what Deng Xiaoping started, and which got a lot of attention in the US and the West as a whole, was to move away from Marxist economic principles toward more market-oriented principles. And not surprisingly, the Chinese economy began to grow. That should tell us something right there. But from these reforms that Deng Xiaoping began and some of his successors continued, American policy toward China was based on two fundamental hypotheses. Number one, that the increasing Chinese wealth would create a broader middle class, and that internationally, China would become more like the rest of the industrial world. It would be, in the words of Bob Zellick, a former U.S. trade representative, China would become a responsible stakeholder in international affairs and would engage in a peaceful rise. That was one hypothesis. The other hypothesis was that a growing middle class would lead internally to a more democratic China. And I can very well remember in the early 1990s, people saying, my goodness, at Village X out in Province Y, they had a contested election for headman of the village. And that contested election will spread, and you'll have provincial elections, and then that'll spread and you'll have national elections, and China will become an industrial democracy like the rest of the world. That was the second hypothesis. On which our policy for close to 40 years rested. Both of those hypotheses have proven completely wrong. China has not behaved as a responsible stakeholder, economically or otherwise, in international affairs. It is certainly not engaging in a peaceful rise in the world. Let's just take economics. China has been stealing our intellectual property quite vigorously for the last 45 years. In fact, from the beginning of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, the amount that they have stolen from us, re-engineered, and then sold back into our markets at subsidized prices accounts for an enormous part of China's economic growth. And it's a very successful business model. When you don't have to pay for research and development, when you can take it from your customers or others, and then when you have a government that plays mercantilist policies, even in organizations like the World Trade Organization that are supposed to be pro-free trade, where the West doesn't do anything effectively to stop this intellectual piracy, it's no wonder that China is quite content to continue along its way. It abuses the system in so many ways. In the World Trade Organization, when China joined, it declared itself to be a developing country. It still is a developing country. And in the WTO framework, that gives them a lot of advantages. There's no provision in the WTO governing documents to change China's status. So it can be a developing country forever. We talked in the Trump administration what to do about it. My suggestion was the United States should declare itself a developing country. And then we could do the same thing. And somehow I was not able to persuade them to do it. But this is how they operate. I had a suggestion on the intellectual property problem too, and that would be a prohibition on the importation into the United States of any goods or services based in whole or in part on stolen American intellectual property. And business leaders, financial leaders around the country were appalled by that idea because they said, do you know how much trade that would stop? A lot. That's right. That's the proof of the point, that they've stolen so much from us that we have become the source of our own problem. China is going to continue this, and it's part of what they themselves call a whole of society approach to challenging the West. They have what they call the doctrine of civil military fusion, and it means exactly what it sounds like. It's all part of increasing China's military capability. They are engaged in social judgments about their own people. They give their citizens a score on how well they're doing as citizens. How would you like our government to give all of us a score that way? And they envision seeing this pattern spread throughout the Chinese periphery and the Indo-Pacific and ultimately beyond. This is a very sophisticated approach, which we have only recently been discovering in many respects. Because along with Deng Xiaoping's very significant economic policy reforms, he also had China follow the policy of what he called hide and bide. Hide your capabilities and bide your time, meaning protect your internal markets from foreign involvement while penetrating their markets. Don't let them know how strong we're becoming until it's the right time. Now it's the right time. Now we find that Huawei and ZTE, for example, are not telecommunications companies. They're not interested in competing for fifth generation telecommunications business. They are arms of the Chinese state that are determined to take control of fifth generation telecoms and basically have access to anything they want anywhere in the world, all of it available to Beijing. China has engaged in one of the most aggressive cyber warfare campaigns imaginable. Just a few years ago, this is public information, they hacked into the federal government's Office of Personnel Management and extracted all of the personnel files for everybody that was on file at OPM who had ever worked for the federal government. Now you say, well, that's probably pretty boring stuff, a lot of pay stubs and things like that. They extracted everything in the files. In my file, for example, I've been investigated by the FBI so many times for security clearances and one thing or another. FBI has interviewed probably hundreds of people around the country about me. This is true of many other people. I've lived a fairly boring life. I don't care what the Chinese see, but a lot of other people are now completely exposed to China. This effort is ongoing, and over an extended period of time, China has not paid a price for it. So the idea of being a responsible stakeholder engaged in a peaceful rise is disproven not merely by the incredible military buildup that China has undertaken, but by this assault on the economic and social institutions of our country and many others. And on the second hypothesis about Chinese democracy, also 180 degrees wrong, Xi Jinping is now the most authoritarian leader in China since Mao Zedong. And he doesn't show any sign of changing anytime soon. They are reconsolidating not only political power, but economic power in China, recognizing that re-centralizing economic control may result in reduced economic import, which they are prepared to accept in order not to run the risk of losing political control, as happened in the Soviet Union towards its end. And now it is this country that has extended the outreach to Russia and in support of other countries around the world to build this new challenge to the United States and the international order that we have helped create and foster. And that is going to be the nature of the struggle we face going well into the future. So let's just take a couple of examples of where that battle is underway now, or where it may be underway in the near future. The first, most obvious, is the war in Ukraine, which was begun not in February of last year, but in 2014, when Russia really first invaded Ukraine and took over the Crimea and a considerable part of eastern Ukraine. The argument that the Russians have made over this period of time is that basically the breakup of the Soviet Union was illegitimate. It was a Western plot, and that what they're doing is simply rectifying this past injustice. We were told this is what Russia was going to do. In 2005, Vladimir Putin said the breakup of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And the next year, he explained how he was going to put not the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire back together. That's what he's in the process of doing now. And, you know, we all make the mistake of saying this is Putin's war. It's not just Putin's war. A lot of people in Russia believe this. They've been told this for 20 years, and they believe it as a matter of their own nationalism. Notwithstanding that Russia itself, the only freely and fairly elected Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, agreed to the breakup of the Soviet Union with the presence of Ukraine and Belarus at a place called Belavezha in Ukraine in 1991. That followed a referendum in Ukraine where every oblast had a majority, including Crimea. Every oblast had a majority, a clear majority, sometimes an overwhelming majority for independence. And Yeltsin agreed that the Soviet Union would break up along the existing borders for the 15 Soviet republics. So Russia agreed to it, and now they're simply reversing it militarily. What happened in 2014 when Putin used force to make the first assault on Ukraine, the West's response was pathetic. And so it wasn't surprising that over a period of time, the Russians concluded that they could do it again. And there are a lot of reasons, I think, why they chose last year. I think our catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, one of the worst strategic mistakes the United States has ever made, helped convince them that our response would be as weak as it was in 2014. Now, I don't want to rehash all of Ukraine. I'm happy to talk about it in the questions, but the point is this Russian invasion was part of a long-term plan that the United States simply didn't recognize, notwithstanding that we had had ample warning. And what has happened has been that in many respects, our response has driven Russia and China closer together. They were moving in that direction anyway. I've been to Russia many times. in the last 25 years. I'd raised this with Russians, you're at risk here if you get too close to China. It was like talking to a blank wall. It didn't make any impression at all. Now they are very close and they may not be able to escape. You will hear some commentators say, well, the Chinese are very uncomfortable with this invasion of Ukraine and they try and distance themselves from Russia. The only thing that China is uncomfortable with is that Russia hasn't won yet. The Chinese are fully supportive of what Putin is doing. They have increased their purchases of Russian oil and gas, cut off from some international markets by sanctions, very significantly. Undoubtedly, in the next 10 years, they'll build more pipelines so they can get the oil and gas directly overland from Russia. It sure beats loading it on ships in the Persian Gulf and sailing it through the South China Sea, which, by the way, the Chinese have essentially tried to take over, building military bases they have created on rocks and reefs that on a good day were not above the surface of the water. They now look like military bases, which they are. One of these bases that they've created is the size of the Washington Beltway. That's how big it is. But they'd still rather take it via pipeline over land, and they will do that. China is laundering Russian financial assets that are constrained by Western sanctions, laundering it through a very opaque Chinese financial system so the Russians can get out into global markets. There are a whole host of things that they're doing, as are others like North Korea, selling Russia back the artillery shells that they manufactured based on Russian designs over the years. This is a very, very strong and ever closer alliance. And China is the real winner in this. Russia's military performance has been appallingly bad. And yet China benefits from it because Russia becomes more dependent on China. Now, the outcome in Ukraine will be a very material factor in Chinese decision-making going forward. They want to see if the West has the resolve and the staying power to stop this biggest land war in Europe since World War II. I think it's clear Putin at this point has to believe that he can't win on the battlefield, so he's going to wait to see if the West, the United States in particular, in his sights, decides that they're tired of the war. He's not tired of it yet, and if we lose our resolve, and the French and the Germans do as well, and say, why don't we just turn the page on this? Putin will say, fine, let's have a ceasefire in place and start negotiating. And the new border of Russia will be the ceasefire line. This has come at a huge human cost to Russia. We would find it unacceptable, but that's the way they do it. And so if Russia prevails, it is a signal to every other one of the former republics of the Soviet Union. If there aren't Russian forces in your territory already, you better start making contingency plans because they could show up at any point. And the conclusion that will be drawn in Beijing is if the United States is not willing to stop unprovoked aggression on the continent of Europe, which from 1945 has been a central element of their policy that stability in Europe is in the national interest of the United States. If we won't stop it in Ukraine, who thinks we'll stop it when it comes to Taiwan? And so that will be, I think, perhaps the dispositive fact for the Chinese leadership in deciding what to do. Don't make any mistake, the Chinese want Taiwan back. They want it back in a very, very significant way. I don't think that the Chinese will actually attack Taiwan because I think that they've seen what's happened in Ukraine. They've seen the country being ground into the dust. That's not what they want for Taiwan. They want the island and all of its productive facilities intact, particularly the very sophisticated manufacturing facilities for silicon chips. Something that we allowed to develop in Taiwan and South Korea over the years. We just watched it move out of the United States. You know, Morris Chang, the founder of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, was an executive at Texas Instruments in the United States. He's not from Taiwan, he's from China originally. And he was up to be the CEO for Texas Instruments, and he was passed over. So he said, well, the hell with these people. And he went to Taiwan and built TSMC. We could have had this in the United States. We have just failed at the strategic level in our economic analysis for so long, and now we're vulnerable. But coming back to China, I think what they will do, if they think they can get away with it, is create some pretext of a crisis and put up a blockade around the island to see whether the United States and Japan will come to stand by Taiwan. Because if we don't, if we watch Taiwan be isolated like that, it will fall into China's lap like a piece of ripe fruit. And it has huge economic consequences. This would be the Chinese breakthrough and the first island chain that surrounds China in the Western Pacific. Douglas MacArthur once called Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It's a loyal ally of the United States. I've been there many, many times. I was just there back in the spring. And, you know, in the office of the Taiwanese foreign minister, obviously he has a Republic of China flag. That's still their formal name. And right next to it, he's got a full floor-size model of the Ukrainian flag, because he knows what Taiwan's place is. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, come on, Taiwan, it's 25 million people. You know, China's 1.2 billion. It's so far away. And besides, they're all Chinese. That's what the one China policy means, right? No, it doesn't mean that. The one China policy, which stems from what's called the Shanghai Communique, Richard Nixon's visit there in 1972, says on this issue, the United States acknowledges, let me just stop there. The United States acknowledges, doesn't agree, doesn't accept, doesn't endorse. The United States acknowledges that all Chinese on both sides of the strait believe there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of it. Now, just think about that. We announce all Chinese believe this. I don't think we took a public opinion survey or anything, but we talked about all Chinese. Let me just give you this interesting statistic. That based on surveys that on Taiwan, National Chengchi University has taken beginning in 1991, asked the same question every year for until 2022 is the most recent survey. They asked the question, on Taiwan, do you consider yourself Chinese, Chinese Taiwanese, or Taiwanese? And here are the numbers from 1992 to 2022. First, the number of people who didn't answer dropped from 11% to 4%, which shows everybody's making their mind up. But listen to these numbers. 1992 to 2022, those identifying as Chinese have gone from 26% to 3%. Those identifying as Taiwanese, Chinese have gone from 46% to 33%. And those identifying as Taiwanese have gone from 18% to 61%. So when you talk about all Chinese on both sides of the strait, it's a little bit different today. You can say, but yeah, come on. You could say in America in 1776, what are you people doing? You're all English. That's not what we thought at the time. And that's not how the Taiwanese think today. So we've got a lot that we need to do. We need to do a lot more across the board in Asia to deal with the Chinese threat. As we have succeeded in Europe with NATO, we now have Finland and Sweden joining NATO, abandoning 75 years of neutrality because they see that the only real protection from Russia is behind a NATO border. We need to be doing more in Asia. We need to integrate Taiwan into larger international structures. We've had some success recently with the decision by President Yoon of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan to join in trilateral military maneuvers with the United States for really the first time ever. We've had great bilateral relationships, but for historical reasons, things are not exactly peachy between Korea and Japan. This is a huge step forward. We have a long way to go. It's not NATO yet, but that trilateral cooperation will be a powerful deterrent to China. We've seen the formation of the Asian Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. Again, a very inchoate kind of agreement, but something that's potentially very important. We've seen the formation of AUKUS, Australia, US, UK project to build 10 or 12 nuclear submarines for the Australian Navy, which in present circumstances we can't afford, but which will be models of the US totally interoperable with our nuclear submarine fleet to help patrol the Indian Ocean. And that really brings me to the point that I think is most important for the United States to discuss in the upcoming election. We do not spend enough on national defense. We spend a little bit over 3% of our GDP. The NATO commitment is that everybody should spend 2% or more of their GDP. Countries like Germany still don't do it, and they need to, but we need to spend more. We need to spend roughly what we did during the Reagan administration, something in the order of 5 to 6% of GDP. I'm a deficit hawk myself. I think overall federal spending has to come down dramatically so that we're not adding to our already outrageously high national debt, which means domestic spending has to come down even more in order to get the amounts we need for our own protection. Now, you can argue about the specifics on this, but unless we have a firmer commitment to having what Ronald Reagan called peace through strength, we will be in retreat piece by piece by piece, really for as far as the eye can see. Now, people say some of our allies don't pay their fair share. They don't bear their fair share of their burden. That's true. But let's be clear. The reason we're in the world is not out of acts of altruism. We're not doing this for the benefit of anybody else. We're doing this for our own good. You don't think anybody else is going to do it for us. The United Nations isn't going to do it. No other international organization is going to do it. No other country can do it for us. And if we pull back from the larger world, our adversaries will take advantage of it. Now, this used to be pretty commonly understood. We had a lot of debates in this country about foreign policy, but I tell you, the virus of isolationism is loose again. And if we don't put it to rest, we're going to have nothing but difficulty for the rest of this country, for the rest of the century. That's why I say again, we need informed citizens and voters who tell their politicians they need to address these issues. And I think if we're successful at that, we'll come through it, because the one thing I tell all of our friends and our adversaries around the world is this: don't bet against the United States. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. We have probably about 150 questions. A few of them they already got to the answer, so I only have about 110, but here's the first one. What are your thoughts on the idea that China is in an inexorable demographic decline?
Well, that may be true. Certainly, they've passed their peak population. They're on the way downhill. That means they've got a declining workforce. They've got an aging population. They don't have adequate Social Security structures to take care of it. The one child per family policy has created, depends on your estimate, but a gap of about 40 to 60 million marriage-age men who are not going to get married because there aren't any available women. If you don't think that's not a socially destabilizing fact, maybe we could have a word after this is over. But the conclusion that many people draw, I think correctly, is that doesn't mean, despite the view by the end of the century that Chinese power will decline, because people are the basis of the economy and ultimately therefore military strength. What it says is the Chinese government can see the same thing, and therefore it may believe that right now it is at its peak strength. So if they're going to act against Taiwan along the land border to do more in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, the threat may be much more immediate, and we are not ready. We're not ready for a lot of reasons. Just one statistic, we've got about 285 or 6 naval ships at sea, naval warships. Ronald Reagan's goal was 600. A bipartisan commission appointed by Congress a few years ago said the optimum number was 335. The number of ships at sea is declining as they age out. It takes a long time to build ships. Pacific Ocean is big. You need more, and we don't have it. And that gap's not going to be filled in the next 2 or 3 years under the best of circumstances. So that shows the nature of the risk if China becomes more aggressive.
Talk about India and its role in this area. Are they an adversary? Can they be an ally of ours?
No, I think, as I mentioned, the Quad, the Asian Security Quad, this is a big possibility for India. Now, they've got a history during the Cold War. They have purchased over the years almost all their sophisticated military equipment from the Soviet Union or Russia. Their nuclear program they got from Russia. So there's a long historical relationship. It continues today. India is one of the major purchasers of Russian oil and gas in response to the Western sanctions. So breaking these historical ties is going to be difficult, but there's a powerful argument for the Indians that as Russia comes more and more under Chinese sway, and since China is the principal threat to India, why should they allow themselves to be dependent on military supplies from Russia, which is also supplying China? So I like to say to friends from India, you know, we have a saying in the United States: when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And it's time for India to make a choice, and the sooner the better. Our diplomacy on India ought to be really ramped up very considerably. I think there are a lot of opportunities there that we need to seize.
My audience knows that we have a rule about long questions, but this is a good one, so I'm going to allow it. It's a 3-part question. What are the principal strengths and weaknesses of the United States and China in, number 1, military capacity, number 2, intelligence capacity, and 3, societal cohesion?
Well, China, let's start with the last one. Sure, China has social cohesion. All totalitarian societies look socially cohesive, but that doesn't mean they are under the surface. And, you know, if back in the day when we had more effective intelligence capabilities, we would find ways to undermine Chinese cohesion. Let me tell you, they're doing everything they can to undermine ours. A lot of people talked about what the Russians did, and the Russians did try and interfere in the 2016 elections. One of the things that I'm proudest of that we did when I was in the government was we changed the rules of decision making for offensive cyber operations by the United States, because we felt that relying only on defensive measures wasn't enough. You can't establish deterrence in cyberspace or anywhere else unless you impose cost on your adversaries, which we now can do, assuming the present administration hasn't changed them back. But that is the social cohesion question. Is you got to believe that democracy works, because if it doesn't, then we have no hope anyway. And I think their cohesion is a lot less below the surface than it appears. But brings us directly to the issue of intelligence and military. And this is the lesson that unfortunately we drew when the Soviet Union collapsed, and people said, we've reached the end of history. Now we can have a peace dividend. We cut our military and intelligence budgets in ways that we're still paying the price for. In terms of intelligence, if I could tell you what we euphemistically call our national technical means were, you would be prouder than you can imagine of what our scientists and technicians have done for us in the ability to gather information. Where we are weak is in the field of human intelligence, because of a number of changes that were made back in the 1990s. You know, there were rules about dealing with, I'll call, unsavory elements of other populations. Well, who do you get to spy for you? I mean, come on. The Chinese are very aggressive. There's no doubt about it. We should do more. And in military terms, we're behind in many respects, but we can catch up and I think overcome the problem. People say, but we spend so much already compared to China. Well, number one, we tell everybody what we spend on defense. You know, you can read it in public documents. They don't tell us what they spend on defense. We estimate it. But their spending is increasing dramatically. And if this new axis holds together, then you add Russia and China starting at the level of nuclear weapons and go down. And remember, one reason Chinese and Russian military spending looks less than ours is what they pay their soldiers. Would you rather be a service member in the United States or in China? That's not even a fair question. But that's why we have the quality of people that we do. And, you know, if you're not willing to spend on defense, you're just going to face the consequences.
Was COVID-19 in Wuhan intentional?
Well, I don't think it was intentional, but I'll tell you this, there's no doubt that China has an active biological warfare program. And one thing that you can see in nuclear programs, you can see it in biological research, chemical research, a lot of things that are dual use countries will do in the open, civil nuclear projects, that kind of thing. And then they'll take the results of it and put it into their covert, in this case, biological weapons effort. The Wuhan lab, and by the way, Wuhan is one of the biggest unknown cities in the world. It has been historically a major inland city in China. And so this lab was a preeminent part of their biological research establishment. And I think this gain of function research is what you do when you're trying to amp up, you know, the biological elements into weapons grade capacity. And I think there's a leak from the laboratory. I would be willing to bet almost anything on it. The idea, I don't know if you heard Jon Stewart's interpretation of this. He said, if you were in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and suddenly there was an outbreak of the deadly chocolate virus, would you assume it came from Hershey or the wet market down by the railroad station? It's a little local humor for them.
If you were moderating a presidential debate, what would be the first question you would ask the candidates?
Well, I think asking them to define what constitutes the national security of the United States and what they would do about it would be the first question. But I have absolutely no hope that that's going to be the first question tomorrow night. It's just we are so far out of kilter in how the presidential debates are structured that you know, I can only offer my advice. I don't expect anybody to take it.
And if you were a presidential candidate, what would be the first question you would want to be asked?
Well, you just asked. No, look, it's this is, but we've seen politics in the United States, particularly in the U.S. Congress in the past few months, just become performance art. No, nobody talks about how to govern anymore, but we're not electing entertainers. This is not the Academy Awards vote. We've got to elect people who know how to run the country. And if we could get back to that, we'd be in better shape.
If Donald Trump is reelected president, would he be able to count on his close friendships with the leaders of Russia, North Korea, and others to patch up the United States' relations with China?
You know, Trump thinks that when you have good personal relations between the leaders of countries, the countries have good bilateral relations. So if he's a buddy of Vladimir Putin, and things are good between the United States and Russia. Now, I don't discount the importance of personal relations in international affairs like anything else, but people like Putin, like Xi Jinping, like Kim Jong-un, these are hard men. They know what they think their national interest is, and they pursue it every minute of every day. And I tell you, Trump thinks he has a good relationship with them. They think he's an easy mark. It's just that simple.
Question from one of our students. Do you think China could play a military role in the war in Ukraine? I
Well,
assume that means direct military.
yeah, I mean, I think in effect, they are playing a military role. I mean, we make a distinction in the West between between lethal assistance and non-lethal assistance. And we do it because there are people with high morals that balk at lethal assistance. Money's fungible. When China buys oil and gas from Russia that would otherwise be sitting in the ground because our sanctions have closed off their markets, they're providing Russia with financial wherewithal. They can buy anything they want with it. You know, this recent deal where North Korea is going to sell artillery and artillery shells that are exactly the same as Russia, because that's where they got them from to begin with, also opens a conveyor belt for China, because as the North Koreans ship their materials to Russia, the Chinese can ship new materials to North Korea. And then North Korea can ship those materials to Russia. You can evade sanctions, unfortunately, very easily. And it's not like we have a lot of visibility into what's going on trains that cross the Chinese-Russian border. So I think the Chinese are in this up to their neck.
Political question with regard to foreign policy and foreign issues. If Russia defeats Ukraine, what would be the political impact in the United States?
Well, I hope it would wake people up to the dangers of saying that we don't want to be involved in assisting the Ukrainians against the Russian invasion. You know, the opponents of Ukraine, of aid to Ukraine, have not made strategic arguments, at least none that I'm aware of. They say things like, you know, why are we so concerned about Ukraine's border when we can't control the Mexican border, which is a total non sequitur. It's utterly two completely different subjects. And it's like saying, well, you're failing at one thing, why don't you fail at another too? If somebody would debate us on what the real issue is, then we could have, I think, a more intelligible debate. But it's just not being addressed on that level. I think both for the former parts of the Soviet Union, for countries in Central and Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, really in the Middle East, and in the thinking in government circles in Beijing, the loss of Ukraine would be catastrophic for the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Ambassador John Bolton.
Thank you very much.
John Bolton, thank you so much.